Welcome to New York Bio's virtual breakfast series, a digital program bringing you fireside chats with leaders from across the healthcare spectrum. This week's episode delves into strategic transactions with David Santangelo from McDermott, Will, and Emery, and Sree Kant, the founder and CEO of BAKX Therapeutics.
All right, I have 9:01. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jennifer Hawks Bland, and I'm the CEO at NewYorkBIO. We're very happy that you're joining us for another edition of our virtual breakfast series. It's hard to believe that we are well into November now, and have how many of these that we've had, and how our guests continue to get even better and more interesting. So we're really excited for our conversation today about transactions. I think this is something that we spend a lot of time thinking about, even if we're not talking about it as much. And so we're thrilled to delve in to some of the background and some of the details around some of the most important partnering transactions that our guests have been engaged with. As a housekeeping measure, as always, please put your questions for our guest in either the chat or the Q&A box throughout the conversation. Derek and I will get to those and feed those to our guests today. And with that, a special thank you. Not only is our guest from McDermott, Will, and Emery today, Dave Santangelo, but we also have McDermott, Will, and Emery as our sponsor for the breakfast series this month. So special thank you to them. Derek, I will hand it over to you to introduce David and Sree.
Well, fantastic. Thank you, Jennifer, and Dave and Sree. Thank you both so much for being here. One of the things that I think everyone, thinks about in terms of biotech and building value is transactions and partnerships. They're the things that get headlines for both the bigger companies and smaller companies. They're the things that investors look for. And really, in a sense, there's a bit of validation and a whole bunch of other things wrapped up in it. So it's really great to have both of you here today. So we usually start these things with a bit of an origin story. And Sree, I think it would probably make sense to have you go first. You've got a terrific background from consulting to Pfizer and all the way to starting BAKX. So why don't you tell us a little bit about how you got where you are today?
Thanks, Derek. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, we're good.
Excellent. Thank you. And it's firstly, I'm super excited to be here, and I've been working in biotech in the New York area for many years, and I've been a huge supporter and wanting to drive more biotech action in the New York area. So I'm always excited and happy to be participating in the New York Bio event and talking about possibilities of setting up biotech in the area. In terms of my background, like you mentioned, Derek, I've been involved in biotech and pharma for near on 20 years in different capacities, as an advisor, as a strategist, as an operator, as an investor, etc. I started in the US, where technically I was working with a generic pharma company in India and in London in the early 2000s, and then came to the US, where I was with the Boston Consulting Group for many years. I was advising biopharma companies on corporate strategy, mergers, acquisitions, R&D strategy, and so forth. And then went to Pfizer, where I was doing a couple of things. First, I was running Pfizer's portfolio strategy piece, but later on focused a lot on some of the things that are of interest given the topic, which is external innovation and strategic partnerships. So I was looking at the strategy behind deals that Pfizer did, and we looked at, and I looked across therapeutic areas and across geographies, and including the creation of Pfizer's gene therapy strategy. But over time, I started moving earlier and earlier and looking at ways in which pharma can access novel targets which are coming out of academia, and looking at cutting edge science and verticals that we could look at. It led to the creation of various models through which pharma can collaborate with academia at a really early stage, even before you sometimes know that it's a target to work on. At a really early stage, to think of what are the best ways to progress this science and turn it either into a collaboration that adds to the pharma's portfolio, or into a spin it out into a different company into which the Pfizer could invest. As a logical progression from there, I moved on to a company called Life Biosciences, where I was running the investments and partnerships function. And the focus there, again, was to create companies in cutting edge areas of science coming from academia. Think about senescence, think about autophagy, and building companies in the area of age-related diseases by picking some of the best science from these, from academic institutions and spinning them out into companies. So we built 8 companies, and there was a couple of things that was in my head as I did this at Pfizer and I did this at Life, and which was what I think there could be a different way to do this, and different ways to galvanize investment in partnerships, pharma, VCs, and so on, and build a company in a different way, and centered around the scientific founders and entrepreneurs. And what would that look like, right? And when I moved on from Life, I was looking to solve for a few things. One was, my interest was to work on science that could become a drug that could make a meaningful difference to patients. So that was the overriding interest. It's saying, can I find science that actually becomes a drug? I'm not looking to solve for whether this is something that I can get investor interest in. I'm not solving for whether this is something I can do an IPO with. I'm solving for whether this science can actually become a drug, right?
Right.
And my thesis at that point was, if I find that, I'll find a group of people who have similar incentives, similar alignment, who I can bring together to form a company, and I'll find those investors, I'll find the partnerships to make this happen. And that was the origin of BAKX. So it was, and two of the people that I met at that point in time, one was Evris Gavathiotis, who is the originator, the scientific founder, one of the scientific founders of BAKX at Albert Einstein College of Medicine. Quick shout out to them, wonderful science happening at Einstein. Then Evris's mentor and PhD advisor, Lauren Walensky at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. And Evris and Lauren had worked on the BAKX protein for near on 20 years, and what they found was some exquisite science which got me super intrigued. And as we're talking about BAKX, I'll just say a few words about why this excited me and why we pulled this company together, right? And what was super cool was that they were working on the mitochondrial apoptosis pathway, which is the body's intrinsic way to regulate cell death and cell survival. Now, we've seen some successes in this field. We've seen BCL2 inhibitor venetoclax, which got approved, but over the last 20 years, there hasn't been as many drugs as you would imagine. No one questioned the potential of the pathway, but we haven't quite been able to realize the actual potential that this pathway provides. Everyone had been focused on the survival proteins in this pathway, which is the BCL2, BCLXL, etc. in some ways, because they were relatively, and I don't say easy, that would be a criminal term to use. They're super hard proteins to target and work with, and there are a lot of challenges, but they were proteins that people were able to target to some extent, but not so much the other side of this equation, which are the death proteins, which is the proteins which are responsible for cell death, BAKX and BAK. Evris and Lauren had been able to drug BAKX, and that just completely changed just the perspective of what we can do in this pathway, because BAKX is a protein through which all of the other proteins have to work. And I love saying this. It's like, just saying, I found the Lord of the Rings. This is the one ring to rule them all within this pocket. Now all other proteins have to work through this. And what it means is not just by targeting and drugging BAKX, we're able to target so many indications in oncology, but we can also think of how BAKX interacts with all of the other proteins and find ways to target these. So I'm not only getting this ring, but we're going to go and find the other rings as well. So that just gives us a vision for what we can do with BAKX as a company, right? For us, it's about, we're looking to build and create the apoptosis company, which would really, actualize the potential of this pathway. So that's the origination of BAKX. What was really cool is after that, I was able to lucky enough to find a team, find Jesse English, who's come on as our CSO and came on even before we got any funding. And the reason she came on was this, right? I mean, there's a bunch of people who have been in the industry for 15, 20 years, who've seen a lot of how drug discovery works and where there are pitfalls, and who care now about saying, like, I want to work on things which we believe can actually become a drug, right? And I was able to bring together people like that as and also partners and investors, and we can talk about that a little bit, about how that entire process transpired. But we're in a good place now to drive this science forward, and I'm super excited.
That's a good segue. That's a good segue, because there's so much around what you're talking about that, you know, really does kind of galvanize interest, and it galvanizes where people like to focus on things that are, you know, that they believe is kind of the next step, especially people that have been in the industry for 20 years. They see science that they like, and they say, this is what I've actually been looking for. And they get excited around that. So Dave, we'll switch over to you for a second here. So why don't you give us a little bit of your background? So we're going to, you know, kind of change gears and start talking about transactions, and how do you actually build some value out of good science? Where does the value come from, and kind of how do you bring others into the equation? So why don't you give us a little bit of background on yourself, and we'll kind of segue into that.
Yeah, sure. It's great to be with everyone, and great to be with Sree as well. I really enjoyed hearing about your enthusiasm around, you know, the various things you've done over the course of your career. It's one of the things I like about my role as a service provider, is working with clients and potential clients who really have that kind of enthusiasm for the industry to make a difference in people's lives. It's as Sree mentioned, it's not always about just pursuing the financial outcome you're looking for. I've worked with a lot of dedicated professionals who are interested in really making a difference as best they can, clearly with you know, the goal of making profit, but also really kind of changing outcomes and really helping patients live better lives and people live better lives. So my path is maybe not as interesting as Sree's is, but I've been practicing a little over 20 years. I started my career at a firm called Chadbourne & Park, which is now part of Norton Rose. It's not around independently anymore. I was a general corporate and M&A lawyer kind of for several years, and then had the opportunity to start working for the firm's two largest clients in the life sciences area. Little by little, I developed kind of a knack for working particularly on licensing agreements, some collaborative agreements at that point in time, other kinds of strategic alliances. And little by little built up that skill set. One of the kind of drawbacks of that role, though, was over time that those two particular clients didn't want us kind of pursuing opportunities to work with other industry players. And so eventually I migrated over to Pepper Hamilton after about 13 years at Chadbourne. Pepper Hamilton, which a few years back merged with Troutman Sanders. You might know it today as Troutman Pepper. But there they have a dedicated health sciences group. And beyond the licensing and collaboration work, I got much more involved in kind of operational work for a lot of clients, handling a lot of day-to-day matters. Particularly, there were a lot of middle market clients that firm serviced. So grew the opportunity to be involved in servicing arrangements, manufacturing, clinical trial arrangements, quality assurance arrangements, and so on. And so that kind of helped build up my overall skill set and ability to advise clients across a variety of areas, really from product inception all the way through, you know, kind of commercialization and manufacture. And the smaller clients, you know, many often don't have in-house teams, they don't have in-house attorneys. So, you know, I would often act in the outside kind of GC role for those kinds of clients, kind of, you know, guiding them and advising them as best as possible in a number of areas. They're obviously often in need of capital at those stages of their of the product life cycle, or multiple products if they have a portfolio of products. So there are a number of things that they need guidance on, both operationally and pursuing things. And I don't do too much on the pure investment side, but you know, I view the partnering arrangements often as a method of investment, because it often pulls in significant funds or development commitments, things of that nature. So it's a very interesting pathway sometimes. And so most recently, I moved over to McDermott, Will & Emery, and I'm really excited to be there. They have a tremendous platform to continue to service clients of all sizes, types, and shapes, public and private. And so that's kind of been my pathway in the industry. And it's kind of, in the old days, I'd say it was more focused on pure drug products and small molecule products, but it has kind of migrated, and we'll talk about that probably in a little while in terms of trends. We're starting to see a lot more variety of deals over the years. I do a little bit in the device area. Certainly cell and gene therapies have become very big, collaborative points of focus. So yeah, I'm delighted to be with you, and look forward to launching into the discussion now. But that's been my pathway to this point, and great to work with companies like BAKX.
I mean, I can kind of throw this out to both of you. So I think, there's been a lot of attention on the funding environment because they're easy numbers to track, right? How much has actually been invested across the sector, and it just keeps going up. Public investments, private investments, all of the private funds have reloaded. Partnerships are a little bit more difficult because you have future considerations attached to everything, so that you can have, you don't know a lot of times how much money is actually paid out, how much has actually been put into them. But have you seen a little bit more over the last few years? Has the transaction market heated up the same way that the funding market has? Do you believe that any of the game has changed a little bit in terms of what people are looking for, or what kind of things they're willing to do at an earlier stage? Or is the transaction market maybe a little more tempered when you think about it in comparison to the funding market?
I'll go first and can give you some kind of broad overview from what I see, and then I'd definitely be curious to hear Sree's thoughts based on his own experiences with his company and other players. But I think the market over the last few years, overall has been very, very strong and very, very busy. But I think the partnering and collaboration market's been particularly strong and busy over that period of time. I think you have a much broader array of collaborative activity taking place, where maybe historically companies, players, or academia, whomever, who wouldn't have thought of maybe necessarily working together or pursuing things in collaboration, are doing so and looking for opportunities to do so. You sometimes see now 3-4 companies involved, sometimes in particular things that years ago it might have been just 2. Years ago, I think there was a greater focus on pure licensing as opposed to this collaborative kind of structures that we're talking about, where people are looking to maximize value from different perspectives, bring different things to the table. So I think investment's been very strong, but to a point Sree made earlier, I think there's more of a risk-on environment in the last few years around earlier stage products that I wasn't seeing as much maybe in 2016, 2017, 2018. I think capital was loose, but a little tighter around particular investment opportunities, depending on, have you achieved proof of concept? What stage of development are you at? Are you a little bit further along? What kind of real IP do you have? Those are all still very important considerations, but I think there's been a little bit of an emphasis now on some earlier stage opportunities. We even have clients that are, I would think of them traditionally as more investment type players, taking equity interests in companies, but who are now getting more involved 2 ways, either through more hands-on management of investments, or separately, some of them are creating their own drug discovery and development companies within their broader investment organizations or funds. And, these are hiring in actual staff that are pursuing, real work in the laboratory and doing real things, in that environment, not just kind of giving monies to others to do that. So those are some of the trends I see. And so I'd be, curious to hear what Sree is seeing as well.
So Sree, let's go to you, and let's take it a little bit from your kind of Pfizer days and from the past, but we can kind of bring it around to the transaction that BAKX recently did with Ipsen, which I'm actually going to put the link to the release in the chat for everybody. Before we get there, first and foremost, congratulations. That's a great deal. And anytime I see a company that's either Series A, Series B that can close a transaction like that, I get excited because it's got this level of outside validation, especially when it's with a really good group. So why don't you rewind for us a little bit and then kind of bring us up to how you put that together and really what you're seeing from the development side of this of the equation. How did you think about this as a company?
Yeah, let me talk about this from a few perspectives that I hold, right? One is, you mentioned Pfizer as a strategist in some ways and as a deal maker, and also as an entrepreneur and even just a general observer of activity that's going on. And David on a bunch of things which I think are very accurate. It's an interesting space where I think the roles of various actors here are starting to get blurred and merged. And I don't know if this is driven by people starting to think that, I need to have a full suite of offerings or vehicles through which we partner with and so forth, or whether there is this little bit of the grass is greener on the other side kind of a thing, right? So you're starting to look at farmers who the corporate venture capital is not new. It's been around for many years, but then you're starting to feel like there's a lot more of it happening now, and you're actually starting to see even the titles of folks in corporate venture capital being partners and senior partners, right? This is what they used to be before. It's not technically that they're actually a VC and there's carry and all of that, but the titles, they're starting to behave, or at least try to be more like an actual VC. But on the other hand, you have people who were technically just investors and VCs, and they're changing as well. And now, to the point that they've made, they're looking to start companies themselves. And there's obviously the big groups that we know of who build their own companies. They bring in their own, some they fund the whole company throughout. So they're not so much a VC as a company builder, and they're being fully integrated pharma companies in itself. So you sort of start thinking of, so clearly, each of these groups see value in what the other one is doing, and each of them want to be the other one, or where's this going? And I think there's people will figure out what makes the most sense for them, and so on. But that's something that I've been seeing. The other thing, in terms of, you mentioned, it's been a very active investment climate. There's a lot of investment going in, but how does that translate from a pharma partnership perspective? I think there's been collaborations and partnerships as well. I just feel like there's been a lot more that's been plowed in from the VC perspective into creating companies. Yeah. But that, I see that going into a lot more of the risky areas. You think CRISPR 5.0 and so on and so forth, to say one thing, right? And that's not so much a pharma created phenomenon. The pharma and the industry is probably a little more still looking to come in a little later. This investment in some of these technologies or sciences, which is really out there, makes sense from a VC perspective, and the investment climate is really good, because there is a possible return in 2 years, 3 years, if there is an IPO, right? Not that logic doesn't necessarily work for a pharma. For a pharma, you still want to see something which could possibly become a drug. And I'll talk a little bit about this as to why, when I think about partnerships, why certain pharmas would be better partners for us. It's a question of alignment of incentives. A pharma does not necessarily, the economics of a pharma, be given their core business, works only if that science can become a drug. Right. Otherwise, there is not a 2-year, 3-year window of cashing out in an IPO, right? So it's a different business model altogether. So I think those two are a little different. Now, getting back to I'll say a little bit about our collaboration, which you alluded to, and what I really like about it. I'll say a little bit about the structure, and then I can talk about how we got there. The way the collaboration is structured is, we have a Series A, which we will be announcing next week, because we have a third investor coming on, which I can't reveal at the moment, but it'll be announced next week. But basically, we have a Series A investment, a sizable Series A. But in addition, our collaboration with Ipsen is structured in such a way that it brings in upfronts and non-dilutive milestones towards our lead program, which is focused on the BAKX protein. We still have other targets on other proteins that we're working on, but this is focused on the BAKX protein. And it also is structured in such a way that our pharma partner here, Ipsen, and we share equally in the costs of research, and we share equally in the profits as we commercialize this function. So this does a few things for us, right? One, it brings in a lot of non-dilutive funding right now, and it allows us to progress our BAKX activator program in a way that, in a very collaborative way with a pharma partner, and it brings in very complementary capabilities, which allows us to drive this forward without having to build those some of the capabilities ourselves. It allows us also additional financing, both from a part of this deal, but also from the Series A that we do, to drive our other targets, also build our computational platform and drive this company forward to achieve our overall vision. And it does all of these while preserving value for our scientific founders, for the start founding team, for all of the employees, the early employees and the ones that we're bringing on now as well, right? So that's the larger picture of why this deal made a lot of sense to us. And I'll stop a second if you have any questions, but I can talk through how we approached it and how we got to this stage. And I know that was one of the things that you wanted to talk about as well.
That's good, because we did have we had a question from the audience that I think is relevant here, which is, when you're looking at robust science that can become a drug, what are some of the criteria you look for in that kind of science? I think that's a really important distinction that you made early, and maybe you could just clarify a little bit on that.
Yeah. And I'll say that with the very specifics of the BAKX program, right? And what about this program made us confident that this would become a drug, and why do I say that about this? So when I looked at the apoptosis pathway, and I'll tell a story. When Everest came to me first and said the apoptosis pathway, this is I'm looking at activating BAKX, and I go, okay, cool. Now there's no doubt about the importance of the pathway, but it's super hard, and these people have been working on it for 20 years. So like, yeah, but look at the science. So we read through the science and read through the exquisite work that they've been done, and I understand how they've activated BAKX. Now I realized there are a couple of things here. One, it's real. What he's saying he's doing is real. They have been able to target BAKX as I read through. I did the diligence. I brought in a medicinal chemist. I brought in a couple of people who have worked with me and who have been in my network for a long time. And we read through this and we did our diligence. Said, okay, this is real. We're activating BAKX. Now, is activating BAKX enough? I mean, is that good enough for me to say that this will become a drug? And what do I need to believe? What we know is this is a clinically validated pathway. We have a drug in the market. We have a BCL2 inhibitor, which is venetoclax, which is working on a bunch of hematologic malignancies. Obviously, everything has its limitations and so forth, but it's been a very successful drug, and it's great. So now we know that a drug can be made in this pathway. And we know that the BAKX protein that we're targeting is downstream of venetoclax. It's downstream of the BCL2 protein. So, and we know that the BCL2 protein works through BAKX. So theoretically, now I have a clinically validated pathway, and I have a novel target within this clinically validated pathway, which is downstream of the validated target. And I know that we're activating that target. Now, that for me has de-risked the program to a huge level. How often, and those of you who are on this call and have worked in drug discovery development for many years now, how often do you find a novel target in a clinically validated pathway? That in itself, and this is something that we've talked about so often. And Jessie, who I alluded to when she came on, these are the first things. And both of us, when we were talking about this is like the holy grail of what you would look for as a drug discovery, drug hunter, right? The question becomes really at this point is, how well are we able to activate BAKX? Is that real? Are we activating it selectively, and so on and so forth? And we come through that, and we were content with that. So that for me is what drives.
You don't remove the biological risk, but you do demystify it in a sense, right? You have a pretty good idea of where your target sits. You have a pretty good idea of what you think you'd like it to do, right? So I don't think you can ever completely remove biological risk from the equation, but at least you can be pretty comfortable with, you're pretty sure you understand what you think it might be able to do. And I want to put enough qualifiers in that to not sound overconfident in the face
Yeah,
of biology,
and
lest we need to dodge the light
it's
bulb.
all relative, right? It's all relative to everything that you see. And then there are times when we look at science, which is super new, and I have absolutely no idea where this could go. The potential seems great, but in this case, I know the path. I have if I start thinking about the clinic and where are we going to go, I know that there is a path to follow. I know what venetoclax did. I know which patient populations they went into. We have a feel for where it might work, where it might not work. And then that we know how we can position our BAKX activator. What would we combine our BAKX activator with? That is a huge step forward.
You know, one of the things that's in your partnership that I think probably escapes, that most people at first read, most people will focus on, the $800 million in milestones and that kind of thing. You look at kind of the overall size of the deal, but it's the sentence that says you and Ipsen are going to share equally in the costs and the profits, right? And that's rare, right?
Yeah.
Usually the assumption is that the partner will take over development costs, et cetera. But, it kind of puts you much more involved in the clinical development, and the sharing equally in the profits is a very non-trivial, a really non-trivial clause. So how did you get there? I mean, don't things usually start with, if people are want to put together a partnership, they want to own it? How did you get there?
I think it's it's credit to Ipsen as well, as in how they thought through the collaboration and how we thought about it. And I think it's worth taking a step back here and thinking of when we set out, what were we looking for, right? And how from a partnership perspective or from an investment perspective. And there was one thread running through our head. We were, and this is really important. I alluded to this in the beginning, which is our incentive is to make drugs. My endpoint is drugs. So when I think about a partner, I think about an investor. I'm looking to tick off 3 boxes. The science is super important, but it's also table stakes. You have to tick off that box, and we're all aligned on that, and it's great science. But beyond that, there are 3 things for me. One is, are our incentives aligned? Right. And second is, if our incentives are aligned, can we come up with a structure that makes sense for both of us? And how easy it is it for us? How flexible are we on both sides, and so on and so forth? And third, are people that we're working with the kind of people that we like, and do you think we will work well together or not? Right. I mean, these are the few boxes that needed to tick off, and I'll run through each of those as to why it's important. On the incentives piece, when I said a little bit about VCs versus pharma, and that's a little bit of a generalization, right? I mean, I needed to find a VC or a pharma, whichever, irrespective what the structure of this thing is, who cares about making the drug. Very structurally, a VC's incentives are aligned more towards the next value creation or an inflection point, so that they have a returns that they need to bring to their LPs, which is completely understandable. But within that structure, maybe, and our incentives are to make a drug, maybe we can still find a way to work together. And the good thing for us is one of our VCs, AB Magnitude Venture Group, who's our lead investor, had the same vision as us, and who were set up to actually make oncology drugs, and which helped a lot. And they came in as our early investor. But what this also says, for a pharma, like I said, the economics are built around making drugs. So pharma is a logical partner if I want to make drugs. Yeah. And even within that, which kind of pharma, then that's where the structure part comes in. One of the good things when we were talking to Ipsen was they were very open about how we structure the relationship. The conversation was not around, when we started, not around saying, this is what we can do for you, or this is what we offer you. It was more around, what do you want to do? Larger picture, not with the BAKX program. It's what do you want to do, larger picture, and what do you want to do with BAKX as a company? And that's where we had this. And it helped that I had relationships with folks at Ipsen, with Philippe, who's the CBO, Christelle, who's the head of research, and Stefan, who brought the program to Ipsen, Stefan Peluso, who's now at Infinity. But the conversation is, if my larger picture around BAKX is to build the apoptosis company, drive the BAKX activator program, then work on other targets. The question is, how can Ipsen support me? And that's where they approach this from, and saying, how can we pull together a structure that makes sense for you? Because I wasn't looking to license off a program at this point in time, right? Yeah. So that's the genesis of how we, and it took a lot of conversations. It took a lot of going back and forth, but all that said, we moved pretty fast and got to something that made sense for both of us. The other thing that makes sense for this structure is because the way Ipsen is structured, they see a very core capability of theirs from IND enabling and clinical and
Sree froze.
I think you froze.
Yeah.
It's a good pose.
We'll be back in a second. Well, if you can hear us, Sree, we're going to shift to Dave for a second. You know, Sree was talking about from his perspective, right? From the BAKX perspective, what they were looking for in a partner. Given your experience in the transactions, what do pharmas, or what would they look for in a strategic partner when they're looking to do deals too?
Sure. I mean, there's a lot of drivers of value. I mean, one thing I like about these kinds of deals are that there is no one size fits all, you know, kind of to Shree's point, you know, there's a lot of different ways you can structure these types of transactions depending on the relative positioning of the parties, depending on whether they're kind of both playing in the same space versus if one is more of a big pharma who's looking to kind of bring in a new technology or a new product line or area of business or a focus of development that they don't have currently. So that does definitely impact you know, how the transaction is structured, what the key value drivers are within that kind of deal. As you know, Sree alluded to, pharma is looking for a commercializable product, you know, at the end of the day. So, you know, they're looking for something that can, you know, be utilized in a hospital or put on a store shelf or you know, generate tremendous sales, you know, either in the US or globally. So, but, you know, there are a number of different things that, you know, when we're structuring the actual transaction documents that we're focused on, you know, number one, to Shree's point is, you know, what kind of alignment do we have? You know, what are the relative capabilities of each party and what are they going to bring to the table, both from an innovation perspective, from a development perspective? You know, is it more so that one is going to fund development, but not really do it, but then on the back end has kind of the commercial capabilities, the international or national kind of structure to market and brand and take the product forward into the marketplace? Or is it that both parties have great development capabilities and can kind of actually work together, even in a laboratory or in that kind of a setting? What that brings into play, though, is, you know, to what extent are you know, technologies, discoveries, inventions, intellectual property that arises from that kind of collaborative relationship, how is that going to be owned? Is that going to be jointly owned? And that's all a function of the relative contributions of the parties and who's making the discoveries. And so that's a big component of the structure. Sometimes you have some of those technologies at the outset. Other times those technologies are developed and arise as the collaboration moves forward. You know, we look at a lot of different things, or at least advise on a lot of different things. You know, exclusivity or non-exclusivity in transactions of this nature is a key value driver. You know, you want to be first to market, obviously, and you want to have a dominant market position in a certain place. Particularly, and the second point, and plays into that, is what is the field of use around kind of the license grant or the collaboration, right? Someone might have a broad suite of rights, but only license or collaborate around a particular use of those products or that IP. And so that often plays into the value, right? And we keep going from there, right? Is it territorially limited? Is it you know, specific to only certain markets, or is it a kind of a worldwide global situation? The ability to sublicense is very important, right? Very often, one partner might need that flexibility on the back end for additional investment, or to perhaps abandon something that is not necessarily, you know, that's no longer kind of a key driver of their economics at their particular business. So that kind of flexibility is often important. Some licensors or collaboration partners don't want to permit too much of that. lest they, find themselves working with someone that they're, not comfortable with, or didn't fully diligence, at the time that the original transaction was kind of entered into. I think, things like the length of the royalty term and what kind of IP you have and how strong that IP is, and how defendable it is, are other important things we see. I think for both sides, another important thing are the diligence obligations that each party has. You don't want to put yourself in a position where you're forced to use a level of efforts that's unreasonable given the let's say economic viability of the program or the particular product or IP at different points in time. On day one, it might look completely reasonable to pursue certain programs or territories or things that over time, the regulatory structure or other things has an impact on kind of where it makes sense to lead those efforts. So there's a lot of focus on that and making sure that depending on which side I'm on and representing, we want to make sure that those limitations are not overly onerous or could trip up our clients and put them in a position to see a claim later, some kind of indemnity claim for a failure to bring a program forward. Obviously, if you are a licensor or someone who's giving up or sharing rights, you want to know you have a partner that's going to, be very diligent in taking that program or those rights forward. So, there are definitely concerns on both sides around that. Just a few others I would think about, who's responsible for prosecuting, maintaining, enforcing, and defending the intellectual property is often very important, depending on where those claims might arise and who might be, what other industry players might be threatened by that intellectual property. And one thing I should have mentioned, kind of tied into exclusivity and some of those things, if I didn't before, is non-competition. Certainly when you get into these arrangements, both vis-a-vis your partner, as well as potential acquirers of that partner in due course, you want to make sure you're protected from them, obviously coming back around or a successor in interest, for example, who you thought you were aligned with and kind of collaborating with, kind of being in a position to compete with you and threaten your market, threaten your profit potential of your products. So those are also very important. And I think the last one I would just say is exit. That's another thing that's very important. You want to put yourself in a position to be able to, as a licensee, most of the time, or depending on your position as a collaborator, you tend to have flexibility to terminate for convenience, sometimes on okay terms, sometimes on not so favorable terms, but you do have that flexibility if you just need to kind of bail out at some point. But these considerations are important to both sides. There's all kinds of permutations you can negotiate, but one that I see frequently is, we've both collaborated for a long time. We've both invested significant development dollars, and now one party has breached or done something kind of totally inappropriate. As the other side in that kind of equation, I want to try to recapture as much of the investment dollars I've put into this collaboration as possible, if possible, depending on their financial position. But I don't want them to just take kind of the fruits of our labor and run off and be able to kind of start working on their own program without some of my investment coming back, speaking obviously about my clients, but coming back to them when they've, invested potentially years and, if not millions, tens or hundreds of millions of dollars into a project that unfortunately, as many don't work out. But it's one thing when everyone makes their best effort and it doesn't work out versus doesn't use the right level of efforts or just really folds on the project and doesn't put in the work, commensurate with what the parties anticipated at the outset.
That's when my former career as a litigator,
Right.
that's when I usually should show up.
That's when we dial a different number and we have a different conversation. Sure.
A new player has entered the game. So there's actually a really good question here that I think is important because it's someone who's on the development side who supports, clinical trial design and execution, right? And very often a lot of therapies are developed and run through outside either consulting groups, clinical trial organizations, et cetera. And the question is a good one. They say, what can our group do to stand out with investors or with companies? Or they say at least not make us a detractor, right? So how do you think about third parties in your interactions when you're developing a therapy, because kind of everybody has to agree that everything is on the right path, on the right page. How do those discussions usually go around kind of the third party that you're using, and anyone either wanting reach through or wanting more control of those things? How did those usually go when you're using external vendors? Sree, why don't we go to you first here?
Yeah.
And just so I understand this right, when you're talking about external vendors, are we talking about CROs or?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I think it's sort of, there's a couple of things, right? As we work with our partner, we're thinking through specific capabilities that we have in-house, specific capabilities our partner has in-house that we can leverage to drive this program forward, and think of what's the best way, what is the indication we're going to go into the clinic with, and so on and so forth. And obviously, we are going to engage third parties, and I can think of 3 areas. Right. One is the actual preclinical research work that we're doing, whether it be chemistry, whether it be structural biology work, whether it be some computational work, etc. And in our case, most of the people that we're working with are folks that we've worked with before. We know who they are and why we are working with them. And even within the vendor CROs that we're working with, we're actually picking specific people within those groups that we work with, or our experienced team has worked with. So we're able to guarantee what we're, to the extent we can, the amount of the service and the expertise that we're going to get from them. And the same comes from our partner when we talk to Ipsen and think about capabilities that they're able to outsource or they're able to provide internally, then that's vetted as well. The other area I would think is, I think what I saw someone asking the questions and Dave mentioned as well, is we're thinking it's legal, and legal including IP, which is around creation of new IP, prosecution of new IP. And in a situation like ours, where we have a collaboration with a partner, we could structure it in many ways, right? We do the prosecution, our partner does the prosecution, or we think of a third party who might do the prosecution with us and our partner both aligned on this third party and providing the right thing. So there's ways to structure that. The other bit is consultants, and here consultants who are from a scientific perspective, because as we're thinking about going into the clinic, we're engaging, we are creating, number one, an SAV, which has a lot of clinicians and KOLs who are experts in our disease areas of interest, who can help us think through where we want to go. And again, it's a discussion with our partner to bring in the right people to help us do that. I don't know if that hit on the what you're trying to tease out, but that's sort of how we're thinking about the third parties that we're working with.
A little bit. I mean, I think one of the things broadly in partnerships is that you both have to be comfortable with all of the aspects of the deal, right? You get to a point where you're comfortable with the financials and the numbers, but ultimately you both have to be comfortable with what this looks like from a development standpoint. I mean, it really all comes back to, your original assessment here, which is, do we think we can make this into a drug, right? And if you start with that, and if you start with the end, you can probably get to a little bit more of a shared understanding of how are we going to get there, and that probably makes things a bit easier.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to add that, I mean, there definitely has to be a level of comfort and trust between the partners to make the collaboration truly succeed, especially as you move forward with it. Working on the science and the development and discovery side of it is one thing. As you move into the kind of regulatory focus and how to approach that, and who's going to be responsible for kind of interacting with FDA and other players, the parties really need to be aligned. Otherwise, there could be a big kind of disagreement on strategy and approach, and you don't want that in front of regulators and in front of others that are going to have a direct impact on kind of the future direction of the business. And so I just wanted to point that out. And just to Shree's point also, I think the use of advisors and outside consultants has really grown in recent years. I see a lot of clients use these, and we even recommend it in certain circumstances, depending on where they are in terms of regulatory and their ability to afford fees of firms like mine and other firms, but regulatory, and then also I think the rise of CDMOs have been very interesting in recent years. Even larger companies are pulling them in more frequently to help with early stage discovery efforts, clinical manufacturing and things of that sort, rather than have all those various functions in-house. Even at big pharma companies, they're relying more and more on these specialized companies that can help in these very focused areas.
Yeah, and that's exactly where I was thinking as well. Thank you, Dave. Is the trust element, right? I mean, and I was thinking of this as you were talking about the different elements of how you structure the agreement as well. The thing about an agreement like the one that we have, a collaboration, and Derek, you made the point about it's being unusual from a profit sharing perspective and so on and so forth. It's a more usual agreement, should I say, when it's a more late stage asset, right? And when you have two farmers coming and doing a JV, and this is an interesting part. It's also a trend where now farmers are thinking more creatively about doing early stage deals, especially in an area where they see a super cool science that can become a drug. And the one of the aspects of this is when you're trying to pull together a collaboration of this sort so early, there are so many unknowns. So how do you account for all of that in an agreement, in a transaction? There's so many things, and if you're trying to do all of that, it's going to get super hard. You might actually not be able to get the collaboration done, which is where the trust becomes super important on certain aspects. And the other thing is the alignment of incentives. And you would have to, at some point, critically ask yourself, is it in your partner's interest to behave in X way at this stage? And if the chances are that your partner would behave in that way are so low, then you would probably say, like, I'm not going to make a big issue about that. We're not going to be able to figure this out. Let's put this out, So, and the same thing, the partner will need to trust you on that. So that's sort of how, and that's where the trust plays a big role in the people that you work with. And one of the things I say on that aspect is always listen to what your counterpart is saying, not with their words, but with their actions.
Yeah.
Right? So as you're talking, and there's a lot of companies which would say we're super fast, super nimble, super flexible, but are they actually showing that in the time that you're interacting with them? Are they actually getting back to you quickly? Are they actually, is there, all those things play into this thing, So I think that's sort of how it's. The other bit to this is to your question of who drives the regulator and all of that. One way to do that, you set up a governance plan, right? At this point, we have a couple of, without making it super bureaucratic, you have a way in which you make decisions as a joint group, and you set up committees and work through that. But the overriding piece here is how well can you work with each other, and the trust element.
Yeah, that's a good point. I left off my list, but in a lot of these partnering arrangements, the committee structure and how you resolve issues through that mechanism is a very important element of the negotiations. Usually there's a joint steering committee. There may be some other committees, though they're becoming less common, but there's definitely a committee. And one of the biggest things we fight over are, who has final decision-making rights around certain issues. And, to Shree's point, it's hard to identify it this far out when you have an early stage product or technology or whatever it is, how a lot of these issues are going to play out. And you hope that structure holds strong, and that the parties can, cohesively, manage the relationship through what are usually many, many years of co-development, and then, through registration and commercialization. It's not an easy task, and I think it is important that who you're, kind of getting into bed with at the beginning of the relationship. It's very important to know at least a little bit about the track record of your, future collaborator, how they operate their business, and again, this word keeps coming up over and over again, but alignment on goals is just the critical component, I think, of making the relationship work.
Well, it's interesting to hear you both talk, right? Because you're clearly coming at it from collaborative yet sort of, different perspectives. And what I've heard is trust is really important. The lawyers would prefer, Sree, that you look 12 steps ahead and be able to identify and solve for all of those potential problems, but setting up a structure to help you address the collaboration may be what you need to get moving, right? So you don't get bogged down in the details of what may or may not happen down the road. And lets you continue to develop therapeutics.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
so
And the determination provisions are important because they're not just perhaps a way of mapping out what happens, but you actually try to build in sometimes disincentives for either party to do something, make it painful on an exit, and that helps them better kind of stay in their lane and do what they should be doing as a partner. It's not necessarily a bad thing to have some of those kinds of out provisions and have some negative consequences. It does keep parties on better behavior in many respects.
So Sree, as somebody who's had, kind of a long career in this area, can you talk a little bit, where I realize we're getting kind of close to time here. Could you talk a little bit about, how your prior relationships and how you've kind of built up trust, kind of over the years, how does that kind of stuff impact your ability to kind of step into discussions with an earlier stage company?
Yeah, I think it's super important. Honestly, I'm trying to think about it as if I was an entrepreneur and I don't have the relationships that I did, it's harder for me to walk in and have that conversation with various pharma companies and at the right decision-making level as well, right? I mean, and we all know about the various bio and JPM meetings and the cubicles where we do the 20-minute dating 10 times a year, and then we're hoping to get a pharma interested in it. What help for me as we kick this off is knowing the right people in a bunch of pharma companies and VCs as well to talk to. I think it's important. Oh, the thing though is none of that is a substitute for some of the table stakes, right? You still need to have some very good science. I can have all the relationships in the world, but no one's going to talk to me if I go there with that.
Yeah,
but
good science is kind of the prerequisite, right? You'll get in the door, but if your science isn't very good, nobody's going to listen to you.
Exactly. The science needs to make sense. There needs to be a team that our investors or partners believe is equipped to drive that science forward in the right way. So sometimes there's always going to be gaps. There's always going to be gaps in the data. So you need to have a team and a vision that makes sense. But after that, the ability to get the actual deal, partnership, investment done, having the relationships helps a lot. And that also drives the trust element, right? And I can have that conversation. People would know how I think and I would know how they think. And there are certain things that I would do with certain people that I otherwise, if it's a stranger, I might say, Dave, how do we protect against this? How do we protect against that? It's not that I'm not thinking about it in other things, but trust will help in a lot of ways.
Yeah. So as we get to kind of the end here, so you had said you're going to close your Series A. So we're gonna knock on wood and look for that announcement next week. We're really excited about it. So once you do that, what is your outlook? What is your outlook like for the next little bit? You've got exciting technology. You've got a partnership under your belt. Like, how do you think about building value? You've now got capital. You've got at least some luxury of time. What are the things that you look at over the next little while to take BAKX to the next step?
Yeah, we have our path sort of cut out, right? I mean, this is just the beginning. We've got the funding and we have the partnerships and we have put in place the elements to drive what we have our substrate forward. But there is going to be a huge operational element over the next few months that we're going to focus on. We're recruiting, we're hiring across Boston and New York, both from an operational side and from a scientific side to drive these programs forward. There's a couple of things, and for us in the next year's time, we're looking to drive our BAKX activator program closer to the clinic. We're looking to drive progress on a couple other targets which are undisclosed at the moment that we're working on. One of the things that I haven't talked about as much is our computational discovery platform, which is super critical in terms of enabling the work around this target. We're turbocharging that with the additional investment which is coming in. Our intent is that when we are looking to do our next round, we have 3 key programs coming from our computational platform, and we have other assets around apoptosis that we could look to possibly in-license, partner with externally as well. The larger vision is the apoptosis company. So if I've got the Lord of the Rings, we still need to go and get the other rings that exist. So that's what we're working on.
Great. Well,
Thank
listen,
you.
we're hitting time now. I want to thank both of you. This is such an important area for biotech. Dave, we're so thankful to have you and McDermott, Will, and Emery have supported the program, and Sree, we're really excited about what you're doing with BAKX. I hope all of you have a great day. And Sree and Dave, if I don't see you in New York, I'll very likely see you in San Francisco.
Sounds great.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks
Have a
for
great
Bye,
day.
everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you for tuning in to NewYorkBIO's virtual breakfast series. Join us every Tuesday at 9 a.m. for more discussions with leaders from across the healthcare spectrum. For more information on NewYorkBIO, please visit us at www.newyorkbio.org.